I never believed in anything beyond what I could see with my own eyes and touch with my own hands. I trusted the solid weight of things, the creak of old wood, the smell of damp earth. I trusted what was real and what was here. Everything else was story and imagination and paranoia. That belief ended the night I realized something was following me. Not someone, not a living person, not even an animal. It was a shadow, and not mine. I need to tell this in order so it does not sound like madness. Even though I feel like madness is exactly what has been eating away at me ever since that night. It started quietly, almost unnoticeable. Small details that I brushed off. A corner darker than it should have been. The way light stretched strangely on the wall, even though I stood still. At first I thought it was tricks of the eye. Everyone sees shapes when they're tired. Everyone has moments when shadows slip into forms. That is what I told myself. The first time it became impossible to ignore was last November. I was walking home after work. The air was sharp with cold, and the streets were nearly empty. Lamps buzzed above me and threw pale yellow pools of light across the cracked pavement. I remember pulling my coat tight and walking faster because the night felt too still and too heavy. That was when I noticed the shadow. My own shadow stretched before me under the light. Familiar. I had walked that path 100 times. But there was another shape beside it, long and crooked and wrong. It shifted with the light, but it did not match me. It was taller. Its head was bent, arms too thin. Its hands hung lower than they should have. I stopped moving. My shadow stopped. The other one did not. It leaned forward as though it had taken a step closer. The air left my lungs, and I spun around expecting to see someone behind me. The street was empty. Nothing moved, only the hum of the lamps. When I turned back, the second shadow was gone. Only my own stretched lonely against the sidewalk. I told myself it was a trick of overlapping lights. That I was tired. That I imagined it. And maybe if it had never happened again, I would have believed that. But it did happen again. And again. And again. Each time a little clearer. Each time a little closer. In the weeks that followed, I started noticing it in other places. At work, I would walk through the warehouse and catch sight of two shapes where only one should be. At the grocery store, I would see it flicker across the linoleum floor beside me, though no one else stood near. Even in my apartment, the faintest glow from the television cast something across the carpet that did not belong to me. Always the same figure. Tall, bent, arms too long, head tilted slightly as though listening. At first, it was subtle enough that I doubted myself. But then things shifted. It began to move differently than me. My shadow lifted a cup when I lifted a cup, but the other one kept its hands dangling. My shadow sat when I sat, but the other one stayed standing. It did not mirror me. It did not belong to me. I tried to explain it away. I told myself maybe my mind was slipping. Stress. Lack of sleep. I worked long hours and rarely saw the sun. I told myself the brain can play tricks when it craves rest. But deep down I knew, you do not mistake another form for your own. The first time I felt it rather than just saw it was early December. I woke around 3 in the morning to use the bathroom. The apartment was silent except for the faint groan of pipes in the walls. I did not bother turning on a light in the hallway. The glow from the street lamps outside bled through thin curtains just enough to guide me. Halfway down the hall, I froze. A weight pressed behind me. The kind of sensation you get when someone stands too close. A presence that thickens the air. My skin prickled. Every nerve told me there was something right there, just at my back. I turned quickly, expecting maybe I had left the door unlocked and someone had broken in. But the hallway was empty. Yet when I glanced down at the floor, my shadow stretched forward, and beside it was the other one. It was not attached to me. Its feet ended inches away from mine, a sliver of pale space between us. It leaned forward as if it might slide into me. I stumbled back into the bathroom and slammed the door. My pulse hammered in my ears. I could not bring myself to turn the light on at first, because I was terrified of what I might see if the room filled with brightness. But the dark was worse. When I finally flipped the switch, the bathroom flooded with light, and I saw only my shadow on the tiles. Alone. Ordinary. But I knew it had been there. I knew it was not imagination. I could still feel the weight of it pressing into me, like a second skin that refused to attach. From that night on, I slept with lights on. It did not help. Shadows still find you when you do not want them to. By late December, things escalated. My apartment no longer felt like mine. Every corner seemed wrong. Too deep. Too dark. I started avoiding mirrors because sometimes when I glanced into them, I swore I caught a glimpse of that tall, bent figure standing just behind me, though when I turned, nothing was there. Friends noticed I was withdrawing. I lied and said work was overwhelming. They believed me. No one wants to hear the truth that something impossible is following you. One night, near Christmas, I forced myself to meet a friend for dinner. I thought being around people would ground me, remind me of normal life. The restaurant was warm and full of chatter. For a little while I almost felt safe, until I saw the reflection in the window. Outside the glass, snow fell heavy and soft. My reflection sat across from my friend, just as it should. But behind me in the glass stood that other figure, clearer than ever. Its head nearly brushed the ceiling. Its arms hung limp like ropes. And though its face was only shadow, I felt its eyes drilling into me. I remember dropping my fork. My friend asked if I was all right. I could not answer. I kept staring at the window until the reflection faded like smoke. From that moment, I knew I could not run from it. Wherever I went, it came too. That was the first time I realized something else. It was getting stronger. It was no longer just following. It was waiting. After that night in the restaurant, I knew I could not stay in my apartment much longer, but the idea of leaving brought no relief because a shadow followed me even in the few moments I spent outdoors, even in well-lit streets and crowded areas. It lingered on the edges of my vision like a stain that refuses to wash away. I tried to keep my life normal, at first pretending nothing had changed, going to work, eating meals with friends, but everything felt wrong, and everywhere I looked, I saw reminders that I was no longer alone, even when no one else could see it. One morning, I woke to find a movement in my bedroom. The sun had not yet risen, but the light spilling through the blinds outlined a figure in the corner, too dark to be furniture, too still to be human. I froze my body, refusing to move, but the figure shifted slightly, as though testing my attention. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving only a lingering unease like the air itself had been pressed against me. It became impossible to ignore when I saw it reflected in the mirror across the hallway, not my own reflection alone, but the shadow behind me, stretching too tall, too thin, leaning forward in a way I could not match my own posture. My reflection blinked, and the other one did. Not it smiled. I think, though there were no lips, only darkness. It tilted its head, listening. I stopped using mirrors, but the reflection finds ways to appear through windows, the shiny surfaces of phones and television screens, even the glint of a spoon on my kitchen counter. I began avoiding my own home, looking away from anything that could give back an image of myself, because the shadow seemed to grow stronger when I watched it. It started to mimic not me, but my fears, my movements. I would catch it. Standing near the kitchen door, when I had left it open minutes ago, I would see it in the hallway when I had not entered it, yet I would swear it followed steps I had not taken yet, as though anticipating me. I began sleeping on couches and floors because I could not sleep in my bed. The darkness there had become too deep, too familiar. The shadow seemed to linger in corners, waiting for me to lower my guard. I kept the lights on, or at least dim. Lamps everywhere I moved, but the shadow no longer needed darkness to exist. It had learned to occupy the space between what is seen and what is real. By January, I had lost count of nights spent half awake, staring at corners, listening to the faint scrape of nails across the floor, though no nails existed in my apartment. The sound was real enough that my heart thumped in my ears. I tried to leave, but every time I stepped into the hall, the figure was there at the end, a dark silhouette, leaning forward, tilting its head, as though it had been waiting all along. One evening, I noticed the shadow moving independently of me for the first time. I had poured myself tea at the kitchen counter and looked up for an instant, only to see it in the living room, standing perfectly still, then slowly raising one hand toward the ceiling, a hand with fingers too long, too thin to be mine, and holding that posture for minutes before disappearing behind the couch. I could not explain why it had chosen that moment, what it was trying to communicate, or whether it had even noticed me watching. I began documenting everything in a notebook, obsessively noting time, place, actions, shadows, movements, anything I could recall with precise detail, because I felt if I did, now I would lose grip on what was happening and maybe lose my mind completely. The shadow became more than a presence. It became a pattern, a pulse in my life, appearing more frequently for longer stretches, sometimes following me outside my apartment, sometimes appearing behind windows of neighboring buildings, as though it had learned to project itself through light and reflection. I realized then that it did not need to be attached to me to exert control over the spaces I inhabited. I stopped going out at night completely. I stopped meeting friends. I stopped leaving the apartment, except when absolutely necessary. Even then, I felt it waiting on the edges of my vision, and I could sense it leaning forward, stretching thin and tall, watching every movement like a predator, waiting for an opportunity. That is when I started seeing it in the photographs I took on my phone. The shadow, always behind me, sometimes over my shoulder, sometimes across the room, sometimes in corners of frames that I had never noticed before. I began to delete photos immediately and stop taking new ones, but it did not matter. It always found a way to appear like a stain I could not wash away. Sleep became impossible. The shadow haunted my dreams, growing taller and wider and more distorted each night. It whispered, not in words, but in sensations, in the crushing weight of the air against my chest, in the chill crawling along my spine, in the prickling of every hair. I felt my pulse quicken with every movement, and I awoke, drenched in sweat and terror. I knew I could not stay in my apartment, and yet leaving felt like entering a trap. I could not escape. The shadow would follow wherever. When I began to feel my body constricted, my mind consumed by an awareness of its presence. I could feel it waiting outside rooms, waiting in corners and reflections and doorways, and I realized it was no longer following. I had reached a point where its existence was entwined with Mine, and yet not connected, I could feel the pull of it. Even when I closed my eyes by February, the shadow was no longer subtle. It had begun to encroach upon reality itself. I noticed it stretching along walls that should have been empty, sometimes appearing in places that did not exist in my apartment, in the hall that led nowhere, in the corner behind furniture that was not there. It became a presence, not only visual, but tangible in ways I could not explain. I could feel it brush my skin in moments when no one was present. The pressure, the awareness of it, was enough to make my chest tighten and my head spin. I began hearing sounds too faint for anyone else to detect, faint scratching, faint breathing, faint whispers. I could not discern words, but they were deliberate enough to make me turn my head, my body react, my heart hammer in my chest. Sometimes I would catch the edge of figure in the corner of my eye, and when I turned it would vanish, leaving only the feeling that it had been there, watching, waiting, judging. The first direct contact came unexpectedly one night. I had returned home later than usual, exhausted and trembling. The hallway light flickered as I moved down the corridor, and I felt it standing there at the end, its head tilted, its arms dangling just above the floor. It made no sound, but I felt its presence push against me so strongly that I could not take another step. I froze and felt my breath leave my lungs. I wanted to scream, to run, to anything that would break the hold of it, but my body refused to respond. And then it moved. I do not know how it moved or why I saw it as movement, because it did not walk or run. It simply changed position closer to me. Across the length of the hallway it leaned forward, just slightly tilting its head, and I felt the cold press against my skin, not like wind, but like ice sliding across the surface of my body. And I realized then it had been measuring me, studying me, calculating how I would react. I backed away, slowly tripping over the carpet and falling hard into the wall. I tried to lift myself, but every movement seemed slowed, as if gravity had doubled and the hallway stretched longer than it had been moments ago. I could feel the shadow watching, calculating, waiting, and I began to cry tears I did not know I had in me. I cried because I knew I had no control, and that it was only a matter of time before it would not need to wait. Sleep became a battleground. I could not close my eyes without feeling it leaning over me, stretching over me, pressing in through my vision and my mind. I began keeping lights on, even when I slept. Lights on, every room lights on, every hallway lights on, every window. But it still found a way to appear between the lamps, between the shadows, between the walls, like it had learned to live in the space between things, the places where light does not reach, the places where our eyes are not meant to look. I started to hear whispers in the dark corners of rooms. It never came closer than a step, and yet it seemed to press upon me every day. Every hour, every movement I made, I could feel its presence in my chest, in my feet, in my hands, in my mind. And I began to realize it was teaching me to fear in a way that nothing else ever could, to live in terror, to anticipate it, to measure my life in relation to its attention. By March, I was exhausted, my mind fraying. I began to feel it stretch across the apartment like a living thing that was older and slower than time itself. It moved like smoke, yet held weight. I began to notice objects moving when I was not present. Small objects, keys, coins, papers, they would shift slightly, leaving traces of its existence. I started documenting everything again in a notebook, counting its appearances, describing movements, writing every sensation in detail, hoping that some pattern might emerge that would make sense, but none ever did. And then came the first night. I awoke to find it at the edge of my bed, its head tilted, its arms dangling just inches from my shoulder. I could feel the heat of its presence, the pressure of it, the weight of it pressing into me. Though it did not touch me, And I realized then that it did not need to be attached to exist. It did not need to touch to dominate. It simply existed. And my mind had learned to feel it everywhere. I began to speak to it out loud, sometimes asking it to leave, sometimes screaming, sometimes begging, sometimes reasoning, sometimes cursing, sometimes crying, and I noticed it never responded in sound, only in movement, in pressure, in the shifting of shadows, in the bending of light. And I realized finally that it had become something more than shadow, more than figure, more than following. It had become a constant awareness in my life, a weight I could not escape. I knew I could not live like this indefinitely, and yet I could not leave my apartment because it followed me outside. It would wait at intersections. It would stretch along the walls of buildings. It would appear in shop windows and on the pavement. I could not go anywhere without feeling it measuring me, calculating me, waiting, and I began to understand the truth that it was older than me, older than the world, older than understanding. It had no need for attachment because it had patience infinite, and it would wait and watch until I could no longer resist. I began to dream of it in sleep, and in dreams it became more than shadow. It spoke. Without words, it leaned over me. In visions, it pressed against me. In impossible forms, I woke drenched in sweat, shaking and crying, and I knew then that the shadow had learned to occupy my consciousness as surely as it occupied space outside of me. It was there whether I looked or not, and I began to feel that the only escape would be to disappear completely, to leave body and mind. And yet even then, I suspected it would follow. By April, the shadow had stopped pretending to merely follow. It began to assert itself in ways I could no longer ignore. It appeared not only at the edges of my vision, but in spaces I thought were safe. It would stretch across doorways, linger at the tops of staircases, curl along walls in patterns that made no sense. The apartment itself seemed to warp around its presence, as though the building conspired to accommodate it. I began to notice that light no longer mattered. It appeared in bright sunlit rooms, in the glow of my television, in the reflection of windows and mirrors. Even when I carried flashlights, it slipped past the beams or lingered beyond them, teasing me with the knowledge that I could never fully illuminate it. And I realized that for the first time, I was not afraid of the dark. I was afraid of what existed in the spaces between. Sleep became impossible. I would close my eyes and see it pressed against the inside of my eyelids, leaning over me in impossible angles, stretching taller than the ceiling, reaching across walls and floors in shapes that could not exist in 3 dimensions. I would wake with my body trembling, with sweat my chest tight, my throat raw from screaming silently, because I knew the moment I opened my eyes, it would be waiting closer than before. I began to notice patterns in its appearances. The moments when it chose to show itself coincided with thoughts. I could not control emotions. I could not suppress moments of weakness. When my mind wandered, it seemed to feed on those moments, growing bolder, leaning closer, moving in ways that blurred the line between imagination and reality. I tried to track its movements, documenting every instance in notebooks and journals and scraps of paper, but each day it shifted faster and appeared in new spaces, leaving traces that made no logical sense. By mid-month, I stopped going outside altogether. I barricaded doors and windows with whatever I could find. I left lights on in every room, and yet it would appear I could see its silhouette bending along walls, through floors, even in the ceiling above me. Sometimes I would hear footsteps, not mine, across the wooden floors, the faintest scrape of nails on tiles, the softest whispering of air that carried a weight I could feel pressing against my skull. I could not escape it. Even the light, I could not hide from it in walls or ceilings, floors, or doorways. It existed in every plane. I began to experience moments of dissociation where I could feel my body moving, but my mind was elsewhere. I would find myself standing in rooms I had not entered, consciously staring at walls as though waiting for it to appear, and it always did, its head tilted, its long, thin arms dangling, its presence pressing against me. And I could feel my heartbeat slow, then spike, then stutter, as if the shadow controlled time as well. As space objects began to move without explanation. Small things, first coins, keys, papers, glasses, they would shift slightly from one place to another, impossible distances, sometimes falling to the floor when I was not near them. The heavier objects would tilt ever so slightly, the doors would creak open on their own, the floors would groan, as though under the weight of something invisible. I could feel it manipulating the physical world as surely as it inhabited the visual one, and I began to understand that its power was not limited to following it, was shaping my environment, preparing for something I could not yet comprehend. I stopped calling friends. I stopped answering messages. I stopped trying to explain myself, because words became meaningless when the shadow was present. I cannot describe it accurately. Its dimensions changed when I focused on them. Its weight was not measurable, its speed not calculable. I could not photograph it. I could not trap in video. I could not document it beyond the notes I scribbled desperately every day, and even those notes were beginning to feel inadequate, as though it could erase or alter memory as easily as it shifted shape. By late April, I noticed it had begun to interact with me directly, not through objects, not through reflections, but through my own perception. It would lean forward in impossible ways. When I was thinking of leaving, it would tilt its head. When I tried to focus on work, it would stretch across corners. When I closed my eyes to rest, I could feel it in my chest, pressing into my lungs, making every breath difficult. I began to panic in small bursts at first, then longer episodes where I could not function at all, and I would curl into a ball on the floor, rocking back and forth, praying for it to stop, but it never did. One night, I woke and saw it standing over the doorway to my bedroom, its head tilted, its arms dangling, its silhouette bending in ways that should have been impossible. I could see no features, only darkness. And yet I felt as if it was staring into every part of me, analyzing every fear, every thought, every weakness. I could feel its presence pressing into me, and I realized that it was learning. I was teaching it my habits, my routines, my vulnerabilities, and I understood with absolute certainty that it would wait, it would watch, and it would not rest until it had taken everything it desired from me. I began to hear whispers, now faint at first, like wind through cracks, then louder, like the murmur of countless voices. Layered together, I could not distinguish words, only antenna pressure that pressed on the edges of my mind, and I began to realize that it was not merely following anymore. It was communicating in ways I could barely perceive, shaping my thoughts, my fears, my perception of reality, so that every moment became measured in its presence, every action in relation to its observation. I was no longer a person inhabiting a space. I was a subject under scrutiny, and the shadow had infinite patience. By the end of April, I had become a shell. I walked through rooms, counting steps, watching corners, turning my head constantly. I could feel its gaze in every glance of light, every shadow in the hallway, every reflection in glass. I could not eat, I could not sleep, I could not leave without feeling it behind me, and yet it never touched me, and yet I could feel it crushing me, pressing into my very essence, and I knew that whatever was waiting for it would not need to take physical form to claim me. Entirely, the shadow had stopped following and had begun to occupy reality. I felt it in walls and ceilings and floors and objects and light, and in air. I felt it everywhere and nowhere. And I understood finally that it was no longer a separate entity, but a dimension within which I existed, and that escaping it was no longer a choice. I would not sleep that night, and I would not sleep the next night, and I could feel it counting the hours in ways I could not comprehend. The pressure of its presence, compressing time and space into a singular focus on me. And I knew that the final act was coming by. May the shadow had become a constant weight pressing against every corner of my life. It was no longer just a figure in the corner of my eye or a reflection in glass. It existed in the air, in the light, in the floorboards. It moved through spaces I thought were solid. It filled rooms I thought were empty. It pressed against me. Even when I tried to leave, it waited at intersections. It waited in shop windows. It waited in stairwells and alleyways. And I began to realize with absolute certainty that it was patient beyond comprehension, older than understanding, older than fear itself. And it would wait until the moment it chose to claim me. Sleep became an impossible notion. I began to function only in exhaustion, in small bursts between waves of terror. I could not close my eyes without seeing it leaning over me, stretching. Impossibly tall, bending across walls and ceilings, pressing into the air. In ways that should not have been possible, I could feel its weight in my chest and my skull and my stomach and my limbs. It had become a dimension in which I existed. Rather than an entity occupying space, it no longer needed to move, to intimidate, to control, to terrify. It was already everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. By mid-month, I noticed changes in myself. Small changes at first, a hesitation in movement, a delay in thought, a creeping uncertainty that I was not alone even when nothing appeared to be present. I felt my body acting on its own in ways I did not intend, my mind slipping. In moments of weakness, I would find myself staring at walls, unable to move, counting steps in hallways, measuring corners. I began to forget whether I had turned off lights, whether I had eaten, whether I had even left the apartment. The shadow did not merely follow anymore. It integrated itself into the fabric of my perception, into the flow of time. I began to live in relation to it rather than to my own life. Objects moved with greater frequency. Heavy objects, tipped glasses, fell off counters, papers, scattered keys, slid across floors. I could hear it in the softest scratching, in the faintest whispers, in the groaning of wood. As though the apartment itself had become a vessel for it, it was testing boundaries. I realized, and I began to understand that I could not escape it by leaving, because it had already left a part of itself inside me, in my mind, in my awareness, in my senses. Every breath, every heartbeat, every glance I took was measured by its attention. One night, I awoke and saw it standing in the doorway to my bedroom, head tilted, arms dangling longer than they should have been, bending the threshold of space itself. I froze in place and felt the weight of its presence pressing into me so strongly that I could not breathe. I could not move. I could not speak. I could only watch as it extended a hand toward me, and it did not touch me, but I felt it pressing against every cell of my body as if it were sliding inside my chest. I understood then that the crossing was imminent, that it was no longer a matter of waiting, but a matter of inevitability. I tried to resist. I tried to move. I tried to fight. I tried to scream, but my body no longer obeyed me. It felt like I had become a puppet in my own skin. My awareness stretched across the apartment, and beyond in ways I could not comprehend. And I realized finally that it was no longer merely a shadow. It had become a bridge, a passage, a force capable of drawing me into its dimension, a place where attachment was irrelevant, where presence alone was sufficient to claim existence. The first contact came without warning. I woke to find myself standing in the living room, though I had no memory of leaving the bedroom. The lights flickered and the shadow loomed taller and wider than ever, bending the space itself. It leaned forward, head tilted, dangling arms pressing the air, and I felt my mind separate from my body, a sensation of being drawn across a threshold I did not see, but felt with every nerve, every cell, every thought. It was both terrifying and irresistible, and I realized then that my own consciousness was being measured, weighed, assessed by the shadow. In preparation for the crossing, I tried to scream, and I tried to run, but the air itself pressed against me in a tangible weight I could not pierce. I tried to close my eyes, and the vision persisted. I could feel myself stretching along walls, along floors, along ceilings, as though my body had become a conduit for something else, something that existed outside space, outside time, outside comprehension. I could feel the pressure of countless invisible eyes tracing my movements, counting my pulse, my breath, my thoughts, and I understood that it had existed like this for longer than I could imagine, and that I was only one of many drawn into its dimension, one of many who had walked this crossing without ever leaving evidence. The crossing itself felt like falling and rising simultaneously. I could feel my mind separate from my body. I could feel limbs bending in ways they could not. I could feel the apartment stretching around me and yet collapsing at the same time. I could feel air pressing into my chest so thick that it burned. I could feel the shadow entwining itself with my awareness, measuring my fear, my surrender, my inevitability, and I realized finally that resistance was meaningless. That the only thing left was the sensation of being observed, being measured, being drawn into a place that existed beyond normal perception. When it was done, when I had crossed, when the sensation of being pressed and stretched and observed reached its climax, I found myself standing in a space that defied description. The apartment no longer existed. It had become a corridor of shadows, a place of bending walls, of endless corners, of flickering light that had no source. I could feel shapes moving in the periphery, figures tall, thin, bending, too long and too wide, shapes that pressed into awareness and yet did not touch. I understood that I had entered its domain, that I was now a part of it, and that it had claimed me fully, even though I had not seen its face, and even though I had not been touched. Time no longer existed as I had known it. I moved through hours without measuring them. I felt hunger, I felt thirst, I felt fear, and yet nothing was real. Except the shadow, the space it created, the weight of its presence pressing against me, pressing into me, pressing through me. I realized then that it had been patient for centuries, waiting for moments like mine, waiting for the crossing, waiting for awareness to align with its attention. And I understood finally that attachment was irrelevant, because once the crossing occurred, the shadow did not need to follow, it did not need to touch, it did not need to speak, it only needed observation, and I had been observed completely. I am not sure how long I've been here. I am not sure how long I will remain. I exist in a space between moments, in the folds of awareness, in a corridor of endless shadows. And I know that if anyone ever sees this account, they must understand that the shadow is patient. It is inevitable. It follows not to claim immediately, but to wait, to measure, to prepare, and that once the crossing occurs, there is no return, no rescue, no memory that remains intact. I am writing this now because I feel a trace of myself reaching outward, a fragment of consciousness. I do not know how long it will last. I do not know if anyone will ever read this, but I must warn those who sense the shadow and corners in. Reflections in spaces just beyond the edge of vision. Do not look. For it do not attempt to confront it, do not ignore it, for it waits, and it watches, and it is patient beyond comprehension, and when it crosses, it will claim awareness entirely. I have crossed, I am claimed, I exist now in a space where attachment is unnecessary, where presence alone is sufficient, where fear and observation and surrender are indistinguishable. And I understand now that it never needed to follow, because it was always patient, it was always inevitable, and it will continue waiting for the next awareness to reach across the threshold. And I know that if you feel it now, if you see it now, if you sense a presence that presses without touching, that tilts without moving, that measures without speaking, you must run, you must hide, you must pray that it does not find you in the same way, because once the crossing begins, there is no return. The shadow is not mine, and yet I exist within it. It waits outside doors, it waits in corners, it waits in air and in light, and in reflection. It does not need to be attached, because it is patient, it is inevitable, it is eternal, and I am its witness.